Greetings, Poe fans from around the world. My name is Jeff Jerome, Curator Emeritus, formerly with the Edgar Allan Poe House here in Baltimore. Welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe birthday celebration. And today is a great day to celebrate Poe. Now, we do have a special guest with me today. I'll introduce in a second. But this is a little different from what we've done in the past, where we've had segments at specific times during the day. We're doing something different this year because we are, celebrating the life of Mark Redfield. Those of you from the Baltimore area know who he is, and he did fantastic interpretations of Poe's stories for us in past years. And I thought this would be a good time to have an encore performance of everything that he did for us. And I think you'll be pleased because I remember the response from the public when we showcased him last year. It was just phenomenal. The guy was a good actor. So you'll be seeing a lot of Mark Redfield. And then we will go to the Poe grave for the Poe toaster beginning at 4 o'clock and the Poe tribute at the Poe monument. We can't forget to do that. I mean, that's such a tradition, worldwide tradition. I remember many years ago, I went to Romania and people recognized me from seeing me, do Poe events, and it was so odd. Oh, Jeff Jerome, oh, Baltimore, oh, Poe, it was really fun. And they all talked about the cognac toast to Poe. And they said that was very touching. So we're going to continue doing that. But for now, I want to introduce someone to you, someone very special. Jennifer, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jennifer Rouse, and I'm a musician, and I'm an actress, and I do some graphic design and video editing. I've known Jeff and Mark forever, and Jeff for a long time. We worked on a lot of projects together for Poe. With Mark, I've worked on most of the things, his films, his audio dramas, the Poe events. So I think it's wonderful that you're paying tribute to him.
Well, you also, when I look at Mark's accomplishments, your name is always there, like music. Jennifer Rouse.
Yeah.
So you and Mark have really been a team.
Yeah.
And I find that when you find someone that you can work with, that you trust, stick with that person. They will never let you down.
And Mark always had great ideas about things, and it was fun to work on them with him. So.
Oh, his mind was always turning.
24/7.
Yeah.
He'd be up at 5 o'clock in the morning and text me or just, can you do that? And I'm like, no, not right now. But yeah.
Well, I remember when we started planning the funeral for Edgar Allan Poe, for the Poe bicentennial. We said, hey, this is great, good idea. And then it's like, okay, what do we do now?
Right.
But once we started planning it, everything started falling in place, and he was responsible for getting most of the dead people on stage available.
Right. Yeah, because he's been in the theater business around Baltimore since he was in college, so he knows 1,000 people.
And it's amazing that each actor that he found fit the character that they were representing. I'll never forget the actor who portrayed Sir Alfred Hitchcock. He walked up to the stage. Those of you from that, I guess my age group, will remember the old Alfred Hitchcock hour where you have the outline of Alfred Hitchcock and the shadow moves up. Well, that's what the guy did. He walked up to the stage and he turned around. The audience got it. Everyone was like, yeah, that's really good.
I think that actor's name, if it's who I'm thinking of, his name is Ron Burr. And he's a local actor around here.
Yes.
He's really good, yeah.
Yes, but I trusted Mark, and he came through as always. And I think that's one of the reasons why that birthday celebration was such a success, is the people on stage that were representing people that knew Poe, that were inspired by Poe, and it all worked. And one thing about Mark, he never had an attitude. Now, we had artistic differences. That happens all the time.
Yeah, so did him and I, actually.
Yeah. And there are some actors that I would make a suggestion and it was like, I'm an actor and you're not. I'm going to do what I want to do. Get out of here. But Mark was we would argue back and forth, but then he would end up saying, well, Jeff, it's your event and you're paying for it, so I'll do what you want.
Yeah.
Just direct me. And I thought, there you go. Never had a problem with him with an attitude that he was far superior. He was just so easy to work with.
Yeah.
And I think those of you that didn't see last year's event, shame on you, but you'll see him again, and I think you will agree that he was fantastic, totally fantastic.
Yeah.
So anything else you want to add about Mark that the audience might enjoy?
I first met Mark when I was about 8 years old.
Oh.
Both of our parents were divorced, and my dad started seeing his mom. So then that's how I met that family. But and I've stayed in touch ever since. And we kind of fell out of touch when he was in college because he was off doing his own thing with acting. And then I got back in touch with him when I was in my 20s and I started getting into acting. And I always did music also, so we just kind of worked together since then. So yeah.
And he was, aside from being dedicated to Poe, he also was a filmmaker.
Yeah.
It's amazing all the roles that he did. And during this presentation, we're going to show you 2 collages of him in different characters, and I think it's amazing when I look at it. I thought, my God, this guy was really into filmmaking.
Yeah.
So we're all sorry that he passed on, but I'm sure he and Poe right now are probably having a lot of discussions.
Right? Yeah, definitely.
So I think you'll enjoy it. So remember, it will start as soon as we're finished here, and then at 4 o'clock. We will broadcast the arrival of the Poe toaster. And that's the guy that leaves the cognac and roses, been doing it for many years. And then we will start with the Poe tribute, weather permitting, at the Poe Monument. One year, you weren't with us, the temperatures dropped below freezing. It was, I thought I had frostbite. It was
Gosh.
Then the wind picked up. It was awful. So weather permitting, we will be at the Poe Monument. Otherwise, if the weather is bad, we will be inside the historic Westminster Hall. So don't go anywhere. And for the Toast to Poe, you can participate during that event, and we'll tell you how during that event. So I think for now, we're ready to start the show.
Yeah.
And I don't want to leave any stories out, but you're going to see The Telltale Heart, The Raven, Masque of the Red Death, Fall of the House of Usher. So I hope you enjoy these. I know many people, thousands of people did last year. So I will see you again we will see you again at the Poe Monument beginning after the Poe Toaster appearance at 4 p.m. So that's it for now. Thank you for your support, and we always appreciate your comments. Feel free to make comments, and when you do, be sure and tell us where you are from so we can not contact you, so we can see where people come from to view this. Last year, or years before, we had people from all over the world. Germany, South America. We had one person from Croatia that was watching it. So this is a worldwide event, and it's the original. This is the original Edgar Allan Poe birthday celebration, which I began way back in, I think it was 1981, and it continues. So thank you for watching, and again, we will see you later at the Poe Monument. Thank you.
During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate and terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought, which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it, I paused to think, what was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps annihilate, its capacity for sorrowful impression. And acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of the black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge, the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now propose to myself sojourn some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood. But many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which in its wildly importunate nature had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The message gave evidence of a nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said. It was the apparent heart that went into his request which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. Although as boys we had been even intimate associates, yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had always been excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as in a passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time-honored as it was, had put forth at no period an enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered, while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one, in the long lapse of centuries, might have exercised upon the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue from sire to son, of the patrimony with the name which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include in the minds of the peasantry who used it both the family and the family mansion. I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself from its image in the pool, where grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees, the gray wall, the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off from my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of an excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this, there was much that reminded me of the spacious totality of old woodwork, which had rotted for long years in some neglected vault with no disturbance from the breadth of the external air. Beyond this indication of excessive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the Tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me in silence through many dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken. While the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceilings, the somber tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, the phantasmagoric, armorial trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or to such as which, as I had been accustomed from my infancy, while I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar was all of this, I still wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On one of the staircases I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of crimson light made their way through the trellised panes and served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber or of the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow, an air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa at which he had been lying at full length and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it at first, I thought, of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennuyé man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the man being before me with a companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable, a cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surprisingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely molded chin, speaking in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily forgotten. And now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features and the expression they were wont to convey, lay so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, which had been suffered to grow all unheeded and is, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face. I could not even with effort connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the matter of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome an habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by reminiscence of certain boyish traits and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from tremulous indecision when the animal spirit seemed utterly in abeyance, to that species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollowed-sounding enunciation, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit and his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil. and for one which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unusual sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was all alone unendurable. He could wear only garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments which did not inspire him to horror. To these anomalous species of terror I found him a bounden slave. "I shall perish," said he. "I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger except in this absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason altogether in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear." I learned, moreover, at intervals and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling in which he tenanted, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth, in regard to an influence whose supposititious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy to be restated, an influence which some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit, an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets, of the dim tarn into which they all looked down, had at length brought about upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness. Indeed, to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. "Her decease," he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, "would leave him, the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers." While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so she was called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment and, without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me, and my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly to the countenance of her brother. But he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, a frequent though transient affections of a partially cataleptical character were the usual diagnosis. Hitherto, she had stealthily borne up against the pressure of her malady and had not betaken herself finally to bed, but on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house, she succumbed. as our brother told me at night with inexplicable agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer. And I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened, as if in a dream, to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar. I shall never, ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphurous luster over it all. His long, improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of Van Weber from the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness at which I shuddered the more thrillingly because I shuddered knowingly not why. From these paintings, vivid as their images now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to induce more than a small portion which should lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of the designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer. With the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments, it was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth in great measure to the fantastic character of his performances. The verses, which were entitled "The Haunted Palace," ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus. In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion it stood there. Never seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glories golden, on its roof did float and flow. All this was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne were sitting Porphyrogene, in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen, and all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to swing in voices of surpassing beauty the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things, in robes of sorrow, assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never tomorrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home, the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within that valley through the red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while, like a rapid ghastly river, through the pale door the hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more. I well remember the suggestions arising from that ballad led us into a train of thought wherein there became manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men have thought this, as on account of the pertinacity with which he maintained it. This opinion in its general form was that of the sentience of all vegetable things. But in his disordered fancy, the idea had assumed a more daring character and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been here, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collocation of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as in that of the many fungi that overspread them, of the decayed trees which stood around, and above all, in the long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement and its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, and here I started as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the water and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him now what I now saw him what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Our books, the books which for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with his character of phantasm. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work and of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight previously to its final interment in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries of the part of her medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person who I met upon the staircase on the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as, at best, but a harmless and by no means an unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body, having been coffined, we two alone bore to its rest. The vault in which it was placed, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in the oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission of light, lying at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my very own sleeping apartment. It had been used apparently in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of a dungeon keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor and the whole interior of the long archways through which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door of massive iron had been also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between the brother and the sister now first arrested my attention. And Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual in all maladies of a strictly cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom of the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip, which is so terrible in death. So we replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments in the upper portion of the house. And now some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless steps. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eye had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and a tremulous quaver, as if of extreme terror, habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret to divulge, which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagarities of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. There was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it affected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow and yet certain degrees the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was, especially upon retiring to bed late in the night of the 7th or 8th day of the placing of the Lady Madeline within the dungeon, that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch. While the hours waned and waned away, I struggled to reason off the nervousness with which dominion had over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered tapestries, draperies, which, tortured into motion by the breathing of the rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, and rusted uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened, I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me to certain low and indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals, I knew not whence. Overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt I should sleep no more during the night, and endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiable condition into which I had fallen by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken but a few turns in this manner when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterward, he rapped with a gentle touch at my door and entered bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but moreover, there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes. and evidently restrained hysteria in his old demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. "Have you not seen it?" he said abruptly, after having stared about him for some moments in silence. "Have you not seen it? But stay, you shall." Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent altercations in the direction of the wind, in the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew careening from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance. I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this. Yet we had no glimpse of the moon or the stars, nor was there any flashing forth of the lightning. "You must not, you shall not behold this," said I, shudderingly to Usher, as I led him with a gentle violence from the window to the seat. "These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena, not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank miasma of the tarn. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read, and you shall listen, so we shall pass away this terrible night together." The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning. I arrived at that well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. Here it will be remembered the words of the narrative run thus: "And Ethelred, who was by nature of a doughty heart, and was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, who in sooth was of an obstinate and maliceful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders, and fearing the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quickly room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand, and now pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder that the noise of the dry and hollow-sounding wood alarmed and reverberated throughout the forest." At the termination of this sentence, I started for a moment, paused, for it appeared to me that for some very remote portion of the house there came indistinctly to my ears, that might have been in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one, certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. It was beyond doubt the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes of the casements and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm, the sound in itself had nothing, surely, which would have interested or disturbed me. I continued the story. "But the good champion Ethelred, now entering within the door, was sore enraged, and amazed to perceive no signal of the maliceful hermit, but, in the stead thereof, a dragon, of a scaly and prodigious demeanor, and of a fiery tongue, which sate in guard before a palace of gold. With a floor of silver, upon the wall there hung a shield of brass, shining brass, with its legend enwritten, Who entereth herein a conqueror hath been. Who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave him pesty breath with a shriek, so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing that Ethelred had feigned to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, and like whereof was never heard before. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that, in this instance, I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded, I found it impossible to say, a low and apparently distant, but harsh, protracted, and most unusual screaming or grating sound. The exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural shriek, as described by the romancer. Oppressed as I certainly was upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence by 1,000 conflicting sensations, in which wonder and extreme terror were predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting by any observation the sensitive nervousness of my companion. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, which thus proceeded. And now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield and of the breaking up of the enchantment which was upon him, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth tarried not for all his full coming, but fell down at his feet upon the silver floor, with a mighty, great, and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had indeed at that moment fallen heavily upon a floor of silver, I became aware of a distant, hollow, metallic, and clangorous, yet apparently muffled vibration. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair where he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stony rigidity. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely to him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it, and have heard it long, many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it, yet I dared not, oh pity me, miserable wretch that I am, I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Said I not my senses were acute? I now tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow of the coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, yet I dared not speak. And now tonight, Ethelred! The breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield, say rather, the rending of her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. Oh, whither shall I fly? Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort he were giving up his soul. Madman, I tell you that she now stands without the door! As if in the superhuman energy of his utterance there had been found the potency of a spell, the huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant their ponderous and ebony jaws. It was the work of the rushing gust, but then, without those doors, there did stand the lofty and unshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor, a corpse and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From that chamber, from that mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath. As I found myself crossing the old causeway, suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, of which I had before spoken, of extending from the roof of the building in its zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. Then came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dark tarn at my feet closed suddenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and its seal, the redness and horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleedings at the pores, with the dissolution, the scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, where the pest ban would shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of the court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girded it. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave neither means of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair from without or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all of the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there were cards, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security within, without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most Furiously abroad, the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long, straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different. It might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lit with orange. The fifth was white. The sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when its minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came forth from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians in the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions. There was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows each to the other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar effect, no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then with the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decor of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There were some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the costumes of the masqueraders. Be sure, they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers, there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon, there were strikes, the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, momentarily, all is still. And all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro, more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays of the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westernly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable draperies appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on until at length was sounded the 12th hour upon the clock. Then the music ceased, as I had told you, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the belly of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus again it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or a murmur, expressive at first of disapprobation and surprise, and then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod and gone before the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equal jests, there are matters which no jest can be properly made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have been difficult in detecting the cheat, and yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his brow broad, features of his face besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the group that stood around him, "who dares thus to make a mockery of our woes, uncase the varlet, that we may know who we have to hang tomorrow at sunrise from the battlement? Will no one stir at my bidding? Stop him and strip him, I say, of those reddened vestures of sacrilege." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with a deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber, to the purple, through the purple, to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and as he approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly round and confronted his pursuer, there was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in their blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all, was a sense of hearing acute. I heard all the things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Listen and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It's impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me, never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. So by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than the whole week before I killed him. And every night about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made sufficient opening for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. You would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights. And every night, just at midnight, I found the eye always closed. So it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man that vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into his chamber, spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a haughty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were closed, fastened for fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still, said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew that sound well. Many a night, just at midnight when all the world slept, it has welled up in my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since that first slight noise when he had heard, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy him causeless, but he could not. He'd been saying to himself, "It's nothing but the wind in the chimney. It's only a mouse crossing the floor, or it's merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he'd been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he never saw nor heard, to feel my presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed at it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier to courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder. Every instant the old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder. I say louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, a strange noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. Now, a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor. I pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. Could not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yeah, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the floor end of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot, whatever. I'd been too wary of that. A tub had caught all. And when I had made an end to these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For now, what had I to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police station, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things, but ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ring in my ears. Still they sat and chatted, and the ring became more distinct. It continued, and it became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. Well, no doubt I now grew very pale, and I talked more fluently with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much like a sound that the watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose, and I argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise suddenly, steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of these men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible that they heard it not? Almighty God, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew they were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark! Louder, louder, louder! Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, it is the beating of his hideous heart. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Distinctly I remember It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late-night visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger. Hesitating then no longer, "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore?" Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here, I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched himself above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet is blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered. Not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, What it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling. Straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking, what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, with no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from some unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff, this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, within the distant aid, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.